On Sunday, April the 24th, 2016, will be held the first round of the Austrian federal presidential elections. The incumbent president, Social Democrat Heinz Fischer, has served the maximum 2 terms allowed to the Austrian federal president under the country's constitution and therefore cannot seek a 3rd term. It seems that neither the Social Democrats nor the Christian Democratic Center-Right People's Party is likely to win the presidential election, at least not its first round, despite the fact that their presidential candidates, Mr. Rudolf Münsterfer, who has served as the Austrian Federal Labor Minister, and Mr. Andreas Kohl, who has served as the former first president or chairman of the National Council, Austria's lower House of Federal Parliament. Despite the fact that they have a long experience and definitely they have the age factor on their side, neither one of them seems likely to win. Instead, the presidential candidate of the Greens, Mr. Alexander van der Bellen, who formerly led the Austrian Greens, has usually topped the opinion polls, and the right-wing populist Eurosceptic, largely anti-immigrant and strongly anti-Islam Austrian Freedom Party's presidential candidate, Mr. Norbert Hofer, who is the 3rd president or chairman of the National Council, seems likely to finish 2nd in the first round of the presidential elections. According to the latest available opinion polls, all taken published at least on March the 24th, 2016, Mr. van der Bellen has the greatest number of supporters, committed supporters, measured between 19 and 30%. Mr. Hofer has 21% in all of those opinion polls. Mr. Kohl has between 12 and 15%. Mr. Hunsthofer has between 14 and 21%. Then there is one strong independent presidential candidate, Ms. Irmgard Gries, a former Supreme Court of Justice judge and its president, who in these March the 24th, 2016 opinion polls had between 13 and 20% support. Let's turn to a scholarly or more scholarly article. Of course, it should be mentioned that Austria, generally speaking, has, after the Second World War, had one of Western Europe's most stable political systems. Until the 1980s, in fact, public sector jobs, civil service jobs, not just government jobs, were divided according to the proports or proportional system based on the latest federal parliamentary election results between the center-left Social Democrats and the center-right People's Party. But the populist right-wing Freedom Party started to gain supporters in the 1980s and especially the 1990s under its controversial late leader, Mr. Jörg Haider, who served for a long time as the state premier or governor of Kärnten or Carinthia, as Austria's southernmost province. The last time when the Austrian federal president, in a well-published way and notably active way, intervened in the formal democratic process of Austria was during the winter of 2000. Because then the late federal president, Mr. Thomas Klestil, demanded that Mr. Haider, who was then serving as the federal chairman of the Austrian Freedom Party, sign a guarantee that the Freedom Party would act according to the rules of democracy and state of laws in government. And only then did the late President Klestil reluctantly agree to appoint Freedom Party's cabinet ministers in February 2000 in a right-wing or center-right coalition government headed by the former leader of the People's Party, Mr. Wolfgang Schüssel, as the federal chancellor. So theoretically, the federal president has quite much power, including the right to nominate the federal chancellor, regardless of the party balances in the National Council, the right to dissolve the National Council and order fresh elections, although he or she must find a different reason each time he or she does it. Probably also the right to veto laws, but in practice, the Austrian federal president acts as the ceremonial head of state, symbolizing the ideal of national unity, as the Chronicle of the 20th century declared back in the late 1980s, or while covering the 1986 Austrian presidential election won by Mr. Kurt Waldheim, who had hidden his past as an officer of the Nazi German army, although it was never proven that he had personally participated in the Holocaust. Nevertheless, he had been involved in ordering people to be transported to the death camps. Okay, anyway, Mr. Emanuel Sigalas writes in the Europe blog about the Austrian presidential election that the election will be a key test of the relative standing of each of the main parties. The contest is likely to be dominated by the issue of the migration or refugee crisis, and the Freedom Party's creeping influence over the center-left Austrian government, the so-called Grand Coalition of Social Democrats and People's Party. Although the coalition no longer has a great majority in the Austrian National Council, it only holds 99 seats out of 183. On April the 24th, the first round of the presidential election will be held, and Austria is one of the few Western countries to have lowered its minimum voting age to 16 years. Generally speaking, the retiring Austrian federal president Fischer has, according to this blogger or columnist, been regarded as a good president. He has fulfilled his predominantly and widely accepted symbolic duties, embodying and promoting national unity and interests well. He has not had any personal scandals that would have stuck to him, and while he has not been the most charismatic political leader in Austria's history, he has undoubtedly proved to be a sympathetic one. Thus far, Austria's other political forces have managed to prevent the Austrian Freedom Party from holding office at the federal level by joining forces, or even in Austria's capital and its most populous federal state, Vienna. And this probably will be necessary once more on May the 22nd if no candidate receives, as seems likely according to the opinion polls, an absolute majority on April the 24th. Currently, Mr. van der Bellen, the Green presidential candidate, appears to be the most popular presidential candidate, and Mr. Hofer is competing with the independent candidate, Ms. Gris, for the second position. It's clear that the two mainstream Austrian political parties, Social Democrats and People's Party, have lost an important battle. When the Austrian Freedom Party started gaining ground again at the expense of the Social Democrats and the People's Party, as exemplified by the 2008 and 2013 federal parliamentary elections. The once powerful parties of Austria can no longer ignore its populism. Many blue-collar voters who used to vote for the Social Democrats, many members of the Austrian People's Party's nationalist wing switched to the Freedom Party, and that has forced both parties to shift to the right. Then there are secondary issues not so important or relevant for the presidency, such as the candidates' fair play or transparency in the financing of the campaign. They still might get quite much publicity in the 2016 presidential election, but the refugee crisis and its management in the background really will be crucial. So in this respect, both the People's Party and Social Democrats have silently agreed with the Freedom Party on the anti-immigration agenda, which favors a tougher stance against refugees and migrants. An early champion of a European solution to the Middle Eastern refugee crisis, Austria decided to act outside of the European Union's institutional framework when it invited all the Balkan countries except Greece to discuss how to reduce the migrant and refugee flows. Consequently, the question is often raised whether the Austrian presidential candidates would swear in a government involving the Freedom Party. While such a government, of course, consisting only of the Freedom Party is unimaginable because it would not have anything like a majority in the Austrian National Council to which the federal government is responsible. On the other hand, the agenda is inspired by the Freedom Party and it's already a reality. And of course, if the Freedom Party's presidential candidate, Mr. Hofer, performs well, it will continue to be the case. Strictly speaking, it's a second-order election because of the federal president's traditional ceremonial role, but it will indirectly influence the choices and the rhetoric of the parties in power, which in turn feeds back into the views and expectations of the citizenry, and the electoral outcome will indicate if the creeping influence of the Austrian Freedom Party and consequently of the anti-immigration and Eurosceptic agenda it espouses will continue to grow in Austria. Yeah, I should indicate. The next Austrian parliamentary elections are scheduled for October 2018. Traditionally, if there must be early elections, either the federal chancellor or prime minister will recommend them, or the federal government, or then the national council itself. In other words, the federal president would in such cases act on the advice of either the federal chancellor or a federal cabinet or the national council itself. Austria has, again since 2007, been governed by the so-called Grand Coalition of Social Democrats and the Freedom Party. Between 2000 and 2007, it had a right-wing or center-right coalition of the People's Party and Freedom Party under the former federal chancellor Wolfgang Schüssel. The latest opinion polls from March the 7th, 11th and 19th have given the Freedom Party 32 or 33% support, which of course would not translate into a majority given Austria's rather accurate form of proportional representation. The center-right People's Party would have between 22 and 24% support. The center-left Social Democrats would have 22 or 23%. The Greens would have between 12 and 14%. The Liberal Neos party would have 5 or 6%. The other parties would have between 2 and 4%. There is a 4% vote threshold in elections to the Austrian National Council, meaning that only those parties that get over 4% of the valid votes will win seats.